Deployment was supposed to get easier. We got cloud platforms, containers, Kubernetes, Terraform, GitOps, internal developer platforms, and now AI agents that can generate code faster than most teams can review it. And yet, for a lot of teams, shipping software still feels weirdly painful. Not because people do not know how to deploy, because deployment is where all the hidden complexity shows up. The app stack, the runtime, the registry, the secrets, the networking, the database, the cloud provider, the rollback path, the weird internal Jenkins job nobody wants to touch. And for smaller teams, that can be brutal. They do not always need every knob Kubernetes gives them. They do not always need a giant platform engineering program. Sometimes they just need a clean way to build, deploy, get logs, roll back, and move on. So maybe the future of deployment is not more flexibility. Maybe it is fewer decisions, better defaults, and picking the right opinions to outsource. I'm Brian Teller from Teller's Tech, and this is Ship It Weekly. Welcome back to Ship It Weekly, where I filter the noise and focus on what actually matters when you are the one running infrastructure and owning reliability. Most weeks, it's a quick news recap. In between those, I do conversation episodes with people who are building platforms, running infrastructure, organizing events, and thinking through where this industry is actually headed. Today is one of those conversations. I'm joined by Evan Phoenix, CEO of Miren. Evan previously worked on Terraform Enterprise and Waypoint at HashiCorp, and he also built Puma and Rubinius. We talk about why deployment is still painful, what teams keep getting wrong when they try to simplify it, and why small teams may not need more knobs. They may need better opinions. There's also a good thread in here around Terraform, OpenTofu, Terragrunt, Waypoint, platform abstractions, and what happens when tools make users do too much homework before they get value. We also get into AI, because yes, AI can generate infrastructure code. But when that generated deployment setup breaks, who is on call for it? And does anyone actually understand why it was wired together that way? So if you work in DevOps, platform engineering, infrastructure, developer experience, or you have ever stared at a deployment system and thought, why is this still so annoying? This one should be worth your time. All right, let's jump in. Today I'm joined by Evan Phoenix. He is the CEO of Miren, previously worked at Terraform Enterprise and Waypoint at HashiCorp, and he built Puma and Rubinius. We're talking about why deployment is still painful and what teams keep getting wrong when they try to simplify it. Evan, thank you for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
So walk me through your history in tech. It's kind of interesting. I'm kind of curious. How did you land where you are now?
Well, I'm old enough that I graduated from college right after the bubble burst. The dot-com bubble burst. And so a lot of my career is actually informed by lack of opportunity post bubble bursting. I did all kinds of crazy interviews trying to just get any job. I almost wrote web Perl for the web for many interviews and stuff like that. I couldn't get anything. And so I ended up working for like a tiny ISP in Seattle. And then from there, I kind of just was sort of scrapping. I was like, I met a guy in a hallway and he told me about this company he was working at. And so I went to lunch and the lunch turned into a job interview and I worked at that company for a number of years. And so like, I didn't have a moment where it was like, oh, there's this big thing. And so I kind of was jumping around. And the other part of it was I started doing open source work in the late 90s now at this point. And I did it all the way through college and then into my first few jobs. My first few jobs were, I was working at a 3-person ISP. So I wasn't programming. I was like, open source is what I had for programming. And so I did that for a long time. And then I actually, the company I was working for in Seattle at the time was spinning down. Had a Ruby project, and I actually got hired by Engine Yard, for people who remember Engine Yard from the Ruby days, and to basically work on Rubinius, my Ruby implementation, and then also help out with sysadmin work. And I kept ignoring the sysadmin work and just working on Rubinius. And so they were like, I'll just do that. So I got to work on my open source project for like 5 years. They just basically paid me as like living the dream. And so like that sort of balance, like working on open source and then finding a job and finding interesting things and working on open source has been this sort of constant thing. And then it carried me through many jobs. It carried me into a startup that I had before HashiCorp, and then HashiCorp is a great sort of like job and open source thing that carried me all the way through that. And then my current venture, Miren, is a similar sort of thing. It's like job and open source and all kinds of things. And so, yeah, that's the short long version.
Very cool. So my first job was to date myself to a degree, was doing dial-up tech support.
Yeah, me too. That was the ISP. Yeah. I did dial-up tech support. I did DSL tech support, and then we were putting wireless antennas on people's houses around Seattle
for long range.
It was sort of
like
long range,
but directional.
Yes, but big antennas. That was actually how I got how that guy in the hallway talked to me, was because I was carrying a giant antenna, and he was like, "What is going on here?" And I explained it to him, and he's like, "We should have lunch." And then one thing led to another. But yeah,
that's awesome. So where does Miren fit in? What is Miren, and how does it fit into the ecosystem?
So I mean, it's a software deployment system. It comes out of me constantly feeling like we are always struggling with deployment systems, right? Like people have lots of great ideas, and especially now with coding agents, getting an idea out there and getting it like, oh my gosh, I got this idea and I want to put the code together. And then you have to figure out like, how do I give this to somebody? How do I let somebody else use this? Is always like, it breaks you completely out of your rhythm. And so the like one of the original ideas was like, how do we integrate deployment actually into sort of the software development lifecycle, right? So that it's like, it's not this thing where like I spend all this time and now I'm like, oh God, now I got to deal with deployment. But it's like, oh, deployment is part of that. I go through a deploy, I can get the logs. It feels like it's part of the process. And so I have worked with Kubernetes, I worked with Nomad, I worked with most of the AWS products to do deployment. And I felt like they're always missing something, and I wanted to feel like I had my own things to say about where that fit in. And the first cut of it is a self-hosted piece of software. So it's open source. You go and you run it wherever you want to run it. And so that makes it very accessible. That opens the doorway to lots of different people who have different needs. You want a data sovereignty. You want, I'm really cost conscious. I want to run it in one particular way. And one of the big things to do it for us was like, hey, you've got this open source. You can run the deployment system on your laptop. You can just deploy to your laptop. And then when you're going and you're deploying to production, it's the same. It's exactly the same. And so you've got all of all of your rhythm about how do I do it and how do I work is exactly the same. And so now you become that much more comfortable with the system, and then you can sort of grow with it. So
that's awesome. That's great to hear. Okay, so why is deployment still such a mess after years of platforms and abstractions? Why? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, it really is the final boss in some ways of software. I think that it has to do with a few different things. I think that if we all were working in sort of one stack, one system, I think it would be a lot simpler. I don't think we'd be as happy, but I think that deployment would be simpler. And because then there would be just fewer knobs. There'd be, like all the, if Java, maybe not. I mean, it's not like Java Beans really solved all of the problems of the, like the late 90s, early 2000s. But there are so many different shapes that an application comes in. And some of that are just like within the stack, like one JavaScript app could be completely different and have a completely different profile than the next one. But then you multiply that matrix by like all the different stacks and all the different things. And now you've got sort of a giant 3D cube of different ways that an app can behave, right? And I think that deployment systems try to say, okay, I want to do I want to give the power of all of these things all at once? And if so, I have to let you configure every possible thing on here so that I can have every possible stack here, right? And sometimes they're like, well, that's really too difficult. Most people are in this one quadrant. Let's actually focus on the kind of apps that look in this shape, your HTTP apps, request times under a second, whatever it might be. And great, let's sort of focus on that and try to distill down the needs and the function and that kind of thing and make it better. I think that I do actually think it's better now than it used to be. I actually think there was a time where it was better than it is now also, but like, it's just because of the number of variables that come into it. And then what each platform wants to have a unique say on it, right? So they want to say like, oh, well, we've got this cool load balancer, and so you should lean on the load balancer. And now I'm like, okay, I got to learn load balancer, and I got to learn all this kind of stuff, right? And so, or, AWS is like great for like, oh, we've got all these AWS specific services to like make your app work in this one way of these different shapes. And so it's the amount of configuration, the amount of functionality that you want to sort of eke from the platform too.
You think AI helps us bridge that gap better?
I mean, in some ways, yes. In some ways, because it's really good. AI is really good at if a platform can explain itself, the AI is really good at being like, okay, great, the platform works like this. I'm going to basically match the app to the platform, right? So the platform can have a bunch of different things it does well, things that it doesn't do well. And the AI can say like, okay, I'm going to make the app work. You wanted this platform. Great. I'm going to plug you into it. The inverse is also true, although I don't think we're seeing it that much yet, where the app exists as this thing and the AI is like, great, let me find the deployment platform that fits this. I don't think we're seeing that quite yet. Maybe eventually. I do think it's making it better. So
okay, so you've lived through multiple waves of this will fix it. What did people misunderstand about Terraform Enterprise early on?
We were constantly trying to figure out the shape of there's a whole Conway's Law situation with Terraform Enterprise, right? So we were constantly trying to help people figure out the shape of like, what should their repos look like? So in other words, like, should it be like there's a repo called infra and it has like 1,000 modules that are basically going and configuring all these different things. And every time anybody changes anything, we have to run a plan that basically touches like, 1,500 resources or something like that, right? Do you want that? Or do you want like, oh, well, I want my, like, should it be tiered? So it's like, okay, the load balancers are a module, a thing. There's like infra dash load LB, and that's just the load balancers. And so it was, and I don't know that Terraform really ever figured this out, even to this day, if I'm honest. But people were constantly, that was the big question. We had white glove service at HashiCorp at one point that was like, how do I organize my Terraform modules, right? In a way that's like, that I can apply them quickly, that reduces the blast radius, all of those sorts of things. And so I think that was a really interesting thing that wasn't Terraform Enterprise specifically, that was Terraform writ large. I think Terraform Enterprise was what the first version of Terraform Enterprise was the one that I worked on, where it was for people who wanted the experience of having a platform that ran Terraform for them, but they needed to have it sort of inside their silo, whatever that meant. Yep. And so we went through a few iterations where it was just a big machine. Like we scaled it vertically inside the actual instance, and then it would just run Terraform on instance. And it was like so many products, when you see how the sausage is made underneath, you're like, this is all we're doing. Like it was a little bit that in a good way, because it basically made the product easy to manage and simple and stuff like that. Like we were constantly like stripping things out and taking things out. And at one point the product was dependent upon RabbitMQ, and we're like, no, we need to slice this down. Like that's too big of a complexity for a thing that's just running on a single machine. And so
is that for like worker queues or?
Yeah, for worker queues. Because that was, so at the time, this is, Terraform Enterprise existed as a product before Terraform Cloud, which is a weird sort of sequencing, because we had Atlas at the time, which was this the thing that predated HCP, which was like our all-in-one platform, and Terraform Enterprise existed as sort of a side thing to Atlas, and then Atlas eventually gets broken apart. Part of it we go with Terraform Cloud. We still have Terraform Enterprise, and so that RabbitMQ part came from the original vision of Atlas.
Yeah, believe it or not, I was an early customer to Terraform Enterprise.
Very nice.
Yeah, probably much like a lot of the customers, we had a PCI HIPAA requirement
exactly.
where we needed to have state files managed locally. We needed to make sure that everything was self-contained, and then eventually moved to Terraform Cloud, and then eventually
Did you use it in the? You weren't at Dusk.com, were you?
It was not. No.
Okay.
Was it a forms company at the time?
Okay. There's three shapes of Terraform Enterprise. The shape number 1 was only ever seen by like 2 customers.
Oh, okay.
One of which was Desk.com when they got bought by Salesforce. And then the second one was the AWS only Terraform Enterprise, where we basically shared an AMI and a bunch of Terraform for you to run it. That was shape number 2.
Okay.
That's that. And then shape number 3 was a rewrite that I did, which was it made it basically Docker based, and then you can install it anywhere. So
yeah, I forget the name of the application that it was like built on, but Replicated. Yes. I remember going through and dealing with weird Docker IP address allocation issues.
Oh, yeah. All the time.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, I guess it was version 3, but yeah, it was a good product. We eventually moved to Terraform Cloud.
Yes.
And then I think they've since, I don't know what the company does now. It was a few years ago. It was years ago, but it got me excited about IAC because at the time, and this is going to cause a lot of people to cringe. I was at a company where we were using Ansible with no state, right? We were just using Bodo 3 to manage infrastructure, some CDK stuff, but it was so going from that to Terraform was like a huge jump.
Yes.
More recently, the problem you were describing earlier, just about like how do you manage state files, how do you manage environments, how do you manage modules? I feel like TerraGrunt has really tried to answer that problem. I don't know that they've answered it well, to be honest with you, but I think they've tried at least to answer some of that dry issue. But
yeah, I mean they were around right when I was at HashiCorp because the TerraGrunt has been around for. Maybe not 10 years, but quite a while at this point. Yeah. And they had this idea of like, how do you slice your Terraform? And we'll basically like put it in different shapes. And they were very successful at basically saying, we're not going to let you, like Terraform in some ways let you do anything, let you put files wherever and let you organize it however. And TerraGrunt was like, what if I just put like a corral, like put like a little guard around this thing? You can't do all this stuff. It's just like, it's going to work like this. And that is very powerful from a workflows perspective because now people they're having to comport themselves maybe to this smaller feature set, but they're also not having to think as much because they're basically being like, no, it works like this. Like I'm supposed to put it in these boxes. We think about that a lot about that at Miren because part of it is what do you want someone to have an opinion about? Like Terraform made you have opinions about like file structure and stuff like that, right? TerraGrunt is all about like, okay, well, let's not make people have an opinion about all of these things. Let's just make those opinions for them and we'll just tell them what they are. And then they're not having to go about figure out like, should I have an opinion about this? Like a lot of people, when they would start using Terraform, they're like, but can you just tell me what the right pattern is? And they're like, well, like, did you do that? Or is it like this or whatever. And so we would sort of force them in some ways to have an opinion about stuff that they didn't really want to have an opinion about.
That's fair. So where do you think OpenTofu sits in that opinionated stack against Terraform, TerraGrunt?
Yeah.
Atlas, whatever other alternatives there are.
Well, I think OpenTofu is the result of 2 specific things. Obviously, number 1 was a license change, without a question, right? No question, right? But I think that the second one is part of it, which is that the backlog of potential features for Terraform that were sitting in PRs or sitting in issues that the Terraform team was like, no, we're not going to do that. No, we're not going to do that. And so the license change catalyzed people to be like, okay, well, I want a different thing. And then it got runway because it was like, well, look at all these PRs, look at all these really cool features that the Terraform team never wanted to do, that we'll just do those things, right? And so now it's like it's growing all these different going in this sort of different direction because of that, right? It might still exist, even if there wasn't all those features, but I don't think it would have had the legs that it has had if it didn't have that second part, right? And I think that what's interesting is that I was at HashiCorp during the creation of OpenTofu, so we were talking about it and we were trying to figure out what it meant. And what was interesting is that OpenTofu was taking on these features that Terraform was rejecting for good reason, right? So there was a lot of interesting features. There's encrypted state management was one of the big things that OpenTofu took on, that Terraform was like, don't do this. Do not, like, the reason that they didn't do it for the longest time is because like we've run the math, and if you do this, what you end up doing is that you create like this other big, hairy availability scenario that is now, I want to do stuff, and now I've lost the keys to do stuff, and now I can't do anything. I'm sort of like really dead in the water. And so they were like an advocate for like, do it a different way, right? They had all these different things. And so, and again, like maybe that's an example of where Terraform was like, actually, don't let people do everything. They were trying to sort of rein in the sort of field of opinion. And in some ways, OpenTofu is like even wider. Like now you can do all these things, and maybe some of them are good ideas, but at least people are trying them out. So,
well, and secrets probably shouldn't be in state, right? Or anything too sensitive. Or if it is, I mean, lock it down other ways, but maybe that's the answer. Like, I'm sure they were pushing like Vault and like using.
That was really, that part of it was really interesting, because that was the sort of the evolution of your state files as definitive, reproducible data, right? So like one of the reasons early on in Terraform that Terraform would end up having secrets inside of it was because they were like, look, like the state file needs to be the thing, the jewel that you can use to recreate whatever you need, right? And so they were like, you should put secrets in your state file because you want to do this, that, and the other thing. And then what they sort of realized over time was that like that's a hard position to have defense for when Terraform depends on a jillion other APIs. And so it's like, okay, well, like if it already depends on all these other APIs to work anyway, like can't you just make secrets an API that you have to depend on? And then that became a thing that they sort of moved towards. In my opinion, they didn't move towards it quick enough. Like in other words, I always felt like, hey, if you're going to have secrets, just make a secrets part of Terraform Cloud and let secrets live there. Your state files can basically just like not have secrets in them no matter where you are. You can just sort of outsource the secret management part to Terraform Cloud.
That was kind of the idea with variable sets, though, right? I mean, that was where there was
exactly right. That's exactly right. Yes, that's exactly right. But it could have been at a deeper integration level, right?
So for sure. So what did you learn about what devs want versus what they think they want when it comes to tools like Waypoint?
Yeah, well, Mitchell and I started Waypoint in 2019, which was an interesting time to start a new product because right in late 2019. And I think that the thing that we were really focused on was a control plane for back-end deployment systems. So it would be like you would talk to Waypoint, and Waypoint would go off and do things like, oh, I need to do that, I need to build a container. Let me go build a container. And then, okay, great, I will do this, and I will do this other thing, and I will do this third thing, right? And the idea was it was sort of it was just a pure workflow engine for deployment, right? And it sort of farmed out all of its backends to do different things. And one of the things that I learned working on that was you're asking a lot of someone who wants to use this thing to say it doesn't do anything until you do all of this homework first, right? It was a lot of homework to get Waypoint running, and that kind of sucked, right? Like from a usability perspective, but it wasn't great from a like we're working on it perspective. One of the things that we found out that was like a really big hurdle was people would get to the point where they're like, oh, I just saw this on a system and it can build Docker containers. And that part was easy because we would just say, also run Docker on the same machine that you want run Waypoint. Like that was we could easily pave over that. But then they'd be like, okay, now I want to deploy this to ECS. And we'd be like, okay, well, you have to go configure like container registry, and then you got to push it to the configure push to push to the container registry, and then you got to tell the container registry over here to pull. And it was like just getting over the like, where does this image go was a leap. It was like it was a big hurdle for people to get over. Sometimes it was too big, Like they wouldn't even get past that point. And so we worked on it to try to pave over it. Like one of the things that I did was I made it so that if you were using, let's say ECS as an example, we would automatically configure a repo inside AWS's OCI registry to push those images to. So we would kind of just try to pave over that as much as we could, right? But the learning experience I took away from it was like a pure workflow engine is it's not enough product, right? It's not enough. Unless there's this really complicated thing that that people are doing that you're like, I want to come in and I want to just revolutionize this one segment with a workflow engine. Great. But the deployment wasn't that, right? And what they really needed was they needed answers. It didn't need to be all the answers, but they needed a lot of answers that were already set in stone at the beginning. So when I was going to deploy stuff, I was like, it just deployed. It just did the thing. And part of that comes out of the idea of like, again, from HashiCorp that we learned was people wanted us to have opinions, right? They really wanted HashiCorp's opinions. They want to say like, well, okay, well, like, great, it's Terraform, it's Vault, it's Nomad, but how do I set it up? Like, what's the best way? All this kind of stuff. They'd constantly be asking for our opinions, even though we had these sort of generic tools. And so the takeaway that I took from it was like, well, let's just build a really opinionated tool, right? Let's go in and say, hey, we've got opinions. We've been working in the field for all this time. We've got opinions about how this stuff should work and what it should do and how it should feel and what the primitive should be. And we think that if you agree with those things, you will really like our thing because it just does all those things, right? It's sort of really defining that in-group of people who want something that looks and feels in this specific way. And so when we were working on Miren from Waypoint, we took that opposite approach. We're like, let's just build all the pieces. Let's build the thing that builds stuff, that builds the thing that deploys it. Let's not tell people where stuff's being stored, where the images are. Let's just make that not a problem at all that people have to think about and worry about. And that was a big takeaway from Waypoint, right? Waypoint, it never really got traction, and it really got its legs underneath it. Partly, I think, because it didn't have enough opinions. Right. Mm-hmm. It didn't have enough opinions about how someone should actually use this thing. And then just because of things that were happening inside HashiCorp at the time, it ends up sort of migrating over to HCP, and then it migrates away from deployment entirely. It migrates basically to a Terraform front end. And that it wasn't doing deployment at all towards the end. It was sort of misnamed in my opinion. But yeah, it was that was the big takeaway from those Waypoint as deployment system days.
Very cool. So, okay, jumping back to Miren.
Yeah.
And I don't want to turn this into a product pitch, but I am curious. What I do want to understand is what you're trying to fix and like what's broken for small teams trying to ship. What trade-offs are you making to keep it simple?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I'll start on the first one, right? Like, what makes Miren sort of interesting? Is that and where do people and small teams hit problems, right? I think that as I've been looking at deployment tools for years, you have stuff that's really good for a single developer. Like, oh, I've got Docker on a machine somewhere and I just SSH stuff to it or whatever, right? And then there's sort of a gulf. And then you have like, okay, well, I want like a Kubernetes based thing, like that's sort of eaten most of the market, right? But there's not really much in that space for like, actually I'm a team of 5 people that really just wants to like, that are application focused. That are just like, I just want to ship an application. I want to be able to deploy it 30 times a day if I need to. Right. And, there's kind of not a lot there. There's a number of products that try to take what Kubernetes is and build facades and things inside Kubernetes in order to get back to sort of this middle ground of like a thing that would feel good for a small team. But what small teams always run into is now you have not this much stuff like from Kubernetes to where they were, but like this much stuff. My arm is way over there because now it's like, if something goes wrong, it's not necessarily in this top layer. It's basically somewhere deep inside the Kubernetes stack of like your stateful pod got evicted because the memory pressure was too high, whatever it is. Right. Yeah. And we didn't want people to have to worry about that because that team of 5 people, they just want to deploy stuff. They want to get in the groove of deploying. Like they need something that really is getting out of their way that just works the way they need it to work. And so The question was, how do you build something that isn't going to have a bunch of landmines, right? Like a lot of the deep Kubernetes stuff that's really important for big teams are landmines for small teams. And so, and the answer was like, let's just strip it away. Let's just keep stripping stuff away until we get to something that feels like it's the right size for a small team. And that meant like, yeah, it's not Kubernetes based at all. We're stripping that away entirely. We're like, okay, what's the right primitive? Like containers are still the right primitive. Again, you see where Docker is, you see where people are writ large. Containers are still that thing. But then it was like, okay, great. Let's take containers as a primitive and let's just start building on top of them. And so there's things that Miren does that Kubernetes does thousands of times better, right? That's no question, right? But I think that a lot of the things that Miren does, you could do with Kubernetes, but Miren does it out of the box. And with Kubernetes, you have to become like a pretty decent Kubernetes expert to do. Like the simplest one that I can give you is we do a scale to zero application deployment by default. I have a really good reason for doing that is because you're going to run this on a machine, your own computer somewhere. And if it's an app that only is used once every month, don't run it. Don't run it. Like just like let it run the one time a month it needs to run. Like don't take up resources running it, for all 29 other days. And you can do that with Kubernetes. There's a bunch of Knative stuff. There's a bunch of pieces that you can sort of layer on top of Kubernetes in order to do that. But now you become an expert in a layer on top of Kubernetes instead of just a thing that does the thing by default, right? And so it becomes a question of those trade-offs, right? Like we don't do as much as Kubernetes, obviously, but the things that we do are designed specifically to do in that way. And so, and we think that those are the right trade-offs to make for, your teams of like 1 to 20 is really the sort of the sweet spot that we target. So
what kind of applications or workloads or problem statements do you see customers bringing to Miren? Like, what do they come to Miren for that they wouldn't go to Kubernetes for?
Yeah, I mean, they come to us a lot of times. The ambiguity around the Heroku situation is one reason people come to us. And they're like, I don't really want to take on, I really want a system that just does the system the right way. I don't want to become an expert in how to layer a deployment system on top of Kubernetes that is like all the Helm charts and all the things and keeping up on all the versions and all that kind of stuff. They're like, I don't want that. I don't have the time or the team size to do that. But I want a thing that just works. Like when we think about it, we think about ourselves as being application focused and workflow focused. So people come to us and they're like, hey, I just want to deploy my stuff. And we're like, great, that's what we do. We deploy your stuff for you. We support specifically because this is where 90% of the workload is now. It's like we're supporting HTTP applications, out of the box as the first class thing, because that's where people are, right? We have stuff for we sort of started to layer on things for non-HTTP stuff, but like the bulk of our focus has been on how do we run HTTP based apps really well and quickly. And so
where do you think deployment and IAC tooling goes next, especially with AI speeding up code changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things people ask me is like, is Miren in danger of having an AI just code something to use AWS that works the same way? And I think the answer right now is no. But I think that even in the longer term, it's probably also no. And here's my take. You can have an AI go through and code you up a deployment platform in the same that feels similar to the way that Miren feels today on top of AWS. It could those AWS graphs that's like all the different services wired together. It could do that. It could wire all those services together. Is it on call? Is the AI on call when one of those things goes wrong? What happens when the AI is looking at it again after a month of it working and is now having to figure out something is wrong, and it's looking at it again? It's like, this doesn't make any sense. Who set this up? I'm actually going to delete all these things and rebuild it from scratch. You're like, oh my God, no, don't do that. Right. And so there's not the discipline in order to do that. Now, again, I think people will say like, well, maybe the AIs will get that discipline. Yeah. I mean, then you're effectively hiring an SRE to just build that up. And the question is that a good use of your time and or money? Right. Yeah. To have an SRE spend all their time trying to balance AWS services, on one hand. For some people, maybe it is. I think our bet is that it's not, it's just not, it doesn't make sense in the larger frame of things. And so The other point about AI and IAC is that one of the things that we've seen is we've sort of pointed AI at our tooling and said, hey, go deploy this thing, is that our surface area is very small, but very obvious for deployment. And so the AI gets it right every single time, right? Because there's kind of nothing to get wrong. It's like, hey, I see that I can set config variables. I see that I can do deployments. I see that I can do rollbacks. I see that I can get status. Great. So the surface area the AI has to interact with is small enough that it just doesn't get it wrong, right? Because it's like there's not a bunch of ambiguity about what is actually going on. And then the AI knows that like, well, it doesn't know anything, but the API knows that behind all of that is the machinery that keeps all that stuff working in the shape that the API is made to work from. And so I mean, I wonder, like, what we're talking about here is abstraction levels. I don't think abstraction levels are going to disappear as AI gets better. It's going to build new abstraction levels. And then you're basically be like, okay, great. That abstraction level is done. We're good. We're solid. Now I can go to the next one. And the question is, do you, and this was the case for Waypoint way back in the day. People build deployment systems at their companies very commonly. And the thing that we would always hear when we first was working at Waypoint was that I got halfway done building this cool ass deployment system. And then my boss told me, hey, knock it off. Go back to the thing that actually we do as a company. And so then they'd have this half-built deployment system that is just kind of a hunk of junk because it never got finished. And then they have to just suffer with it for years. And they're like, how come the deployment system is so weird that you have to like stand on one leg and shake a thing above your head in order to make it work? And it's like, well, because none of that stuff was supposed to be there. That was all supposed to be paved over, but we never got enough time to finish it because we're a mortgage writing company, right? So like building a deployment system never made sense. And so I think that that's still true when people are applying AI to AWS resources. It's just like you just needed a thing to work. You didn't need any of those other pieces. We want to basically, as Miren, be a person who has opinions. You want to basically buy our opinions. You want to outsource your opinions about how this is supposed to work to us, and then we'll just give you a thing that works.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I fell into the same trap, I think, with Jenkins, like most people did.
Oh, yeah.
Where,
me too.
You didn't have time to fix it, and it was a house of cards. It just works, so you just left it alone,
yeah.
Right?
Don't touch it.
Yeah. No, better to go to a company that can give you the opinions around the stack. You pay for that. You pay for that opinions. You pay for that service that they're going to maintain. So.
Yeah, I mean, I know people who pay for AWS consultants and then that's the same thing, right? And in some ways, you're paying for that person's opinions. So.
Okay, so wrapping up, what's one industry belief about DevOps or platform engineering that you think is just wrong?
I think that people fall into the trap of, I guess it's not DevOps. I'll say what I was going to say, which is,
I
was going to say that I think that people fall into the trap of feeling like, oh, I shouldn't rewrite that. I shouldn't have my own version of this, that, and the other thing. And I think that it's a double-edged sword of basically being like, oh, don't ever always use this one version of this thing, even though it does not, most of it doesn't do what we want, but this one little slice does, right? I think that people should be more willing to say, I'm going to do the thing that works best for me, and I'm going to do 5% of what the other thing does, but it's going to be the 5% that I want, and now I can own. It's sort of like the industry did a lot of hand-wringing around dependencies about 10 years ago, about how big your node module should be and all that kind of stuff, right? I think we're running into it again now with supply chain. And so I think that like having your own versions of the things that fit just what you need is it's way overrated. So
yeah, no, that's fair. I agree with that. Evan, where can people find more about you? You have socials where?
You can find me on Blue Sky. I'm evanphx.dev on Blue Sky. We have a Miren Discord if you want to hit that up. That's at miren.dev/discord. Yeah, that's probably the main two places these days.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Evan, for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
All right. That was my conversation with Evan Phoenix from Miren. My biggest takeaway from this one is that deployment is painful because it sits at the intersection of everything else. It is not just run the app. It is build the app, package it, push it somewhere, wire up the config, expose the service, watch the logs, handle rollbacks, and make sure the next person can understand what happened. And every time we try to simplify that, we usually move the complexity somewhere else. Sometimes that is fine. Good abstraction hides the right things, but bad abstraction hides the thing until production is broken. And then suddenly, the team that didn't need to know Kubernetes has to understand pod eviction, node pressure, ingress behavior, retry auth, and whatever controller is angry 3 layers down. I liked Evan's point that small teams often do not need the biggest, most flexible platform. They need something with a smaller surface area that handles the boring parts well. That does not mean Kubernetes is bad. It does not mean Terraform is bad. It just means flexibility has a cost. Every knob is a decision. Every decision becomes something to support. And eventually, the platform meant to speed everyone up becomes its own pile of work. The AI angle makes that even more interesting. AI can generate deployment code. It can wire together cloud services. It can probably build something that works for a while. But is AI on call? Does the team understand what it created? Does the next person know why those decisions were made? That is why good abstractions probably matter more, not less. A small, clear deployment surface is easier for humans to use and easier for AI to interact with safely. So the practical question is not always, how do we build the most powerful platform? Sometimes it is, how little platform can we get away with while still shipping safely? I'll have links to Evan, Miren, the Discord, and anything else we mentioned in the show notes. If you enjoyed this conversation, follow or subscribe to Ship It Weekly wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find the show notes and links over on shipitweekly.fm. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you later this week.